to Dr. Kelly. And Dr. Kelly, thank you both for coming today. I'm so excited to hear your presentation.
Thank you, George. Always appreciate that introduction and certainly the support for this entire series from eLuma. I'm excited to welcome you back to Office Hours with Dr. John Kelly. I'm also excited to kind of let you know that I'm coming to you from the U.S. Virgin Islands down in St. Croix. I've temporarily moved the office to St. Croix, not to make anyone jealous or not to make anyone feel bad about the cold Northeast or any of that other stuff. But no, anyway, I am thrilled to be here. However, with the move, there have been some technology challenges, so I will apologize in advance if we run into any glitches. We do have backup. George might come back in and finish conversation with Shawna. But this series we started back in August. I gave a kickoff on kind of multi-tiered systems of support, the provision of mental health services along the entire continuum of supports. We had a great conversation with Dr. Kelly Valancourt-Strobach about advocating for these services within your schools. There's such great opportunities at this point in time at the federal level for federal funding. And today I'm really excited to welcome my good friend. I always like to say she's my younger sister, although we are not related. I do say that Shawna is my younger sister, but excited to have this conversation with Shawna and really dive into Tier 1 and really what Tier 1 is all about. So Shawna, if you can go to the next slide. I'm not going to cover your bio other than to say that Shawna is truly an expert in Tier 1 services. She is currently on the speaker tour right now. We were just kind of chatting before we went live here. She's currently down in Houston. She was in Michigan. She's on her way to Utah coming up. And she's truly an expert talking about multi-tiered systems of support. And I have to be honest with you, one of the things that I find not frustrating, but at times difficult when we talk about multi-tiered systems of support is oftentimes schools don't have really good Tier 1 services. And we see the repercussions down the line at Tier 2 and certainly at Tier 3. So Shawna's going to talk to us about Tier 1 services. What are they? What are really good services? What do we need to have in place? How do we use the data? Things of that nature. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in my good friend, Dr. Shawna Rader Kelly.
Thank you, John. So here are some of our learning objectives for today. I am excited to be here to talk to you about Tier 1 practices. As John said, they're so foundational to the work that they do and truly benefit all of our students. What John didn't mention is that when I'm not presenting, I am a school psychologist working in a high school. I'm the school psychologist at Bozeman High School, serving just over 1,200 students in my setting. And so I see firsthand the benefits that we can have when we set up strong multi-tiered systems for our students. And that starts with a strong foundation at Tier 1. So we're going to start by talking about how we integrate Tier 1 practices in a multi-tiered framework, how we look for indicators of effective programs, some of the benefits that we'll see when we're able to implement these programs with fidelity, and then some strategies for implementing these supports. So Tier 1, what it is and how we do it. So it wouldn't be a true multi-tiered systems of support presentation if we didn't start with a triangle. So I will kick off with that. Our focus today will be talking about Tier 1 practices, and these include that positive, inclusive school climate, prevention and wellness activities, equitable educational practices, trauma-informed practices, universal screening, and evidence-based social emotional learning curriculum, instruction, and positive behavior supports. It is so important that we start here by talking about how we create those positive, inclusive school climates where students feel safe, welcome, and accepted. When students feel safe and welcome and accepted, they come to school ready to learn. And so this is an important foundation of Tier 1. Prevention and wellness programming is designed to promote healthy behaviors and positive relationships among students and teachers, and it's so foundational to what we do in schools. Equitable and educational practices are those that are designed to ensure that all students have access to high quality, culturally responsive, socially just education and supports. Our trauma-informed practices also serve as a foundation of Tier 1. Effective universal screening helps us to identify students who may be at risk for mental and behavioral health challenges, and also tells us about the health of our system. And finally, our evidence-based social emotional learning curriculum, high quality instruction, can be integrated with positive behavior interventions and supports that are designed to teach, promote, and reinforce positive behaviors across settings in the school environment. An effective system also ensures that students are provided with more intensive interventions when they're demonstrating difficulties or a failure to respond to our universal supports and our Tier 1 practices. And finally, that system will also include intensive individualized intervention services for students who need them. All of this, though, requires an effective system, and the foundation of that is strong leadership, a climate and culture that's supportive of the staff and supportive of staff doing this work. It's collaborative partnerships and a shared responsibility for student success, collaboration across disciplines, but also collaboration across general and special education services to truly support all students. We also need a sufficient workforce to provide both preventative and responsive services to students who need them, and discipline-specific training and professional development to support our staff members in doing this work and doing this work well. I'm often asked where special education services fall in this continuum. And I truly believe that effective special education services are not a Tier 3 service or a Tier 4 service, as I hear them referred to sometimes. But really, their special education services are just a portion of the services that are provided across the multi-tiered continuum, where students with disabilities can access the services that they need in the least restrictive manner, in the least restrictive setting based on their individualized needs. So truly equitable, accessible services are available to all students on this continuum, and students with disabilities will access those services in the least restrictive environment that best meets their needs. The effective universal supports are equitable. This means that they're available to all students regardless of disability or eligibility category. They're preventative in that they reduce risk for more significant challenges. Responsive services are continually monitored and adjusted. After their implementation, we continue to track students' progress, both at the individual, group, and systems levels, and we adjust those practices as needed based on the data. They are also data-based. That means that our decisions are based on data related to student needs. They're matched to students' identified needs, and they're evidence-based in their development and their implementation. Effective systems are also collaborative, so there's a shared responsibility for student success, and they have to be sustainable. And this means that they are manageable, they're doable, and they're embedded in the school culture. And this is so important to remember, because in schools, we are oftentimes inundated with initiatives and activities. And it's incredibly important that when we're designing and selecting our activities, that we ensure that they're manageable for our school staff, and that we have a sufficient workforce in order to be able to implement them with fidelity. This next slide includes the different domains of social emotional learning skills that are covered in a high quality Tier 1 curriculum. And this is true across K-12 social emotional learning programs. We look for skills that build students' abilities in 3 areas. Their self skills, so skills related to self-awareness and self-management. Their skills related to how they manage their relationships and their interactions with others. These include skills to build their social awareness of how their behaviors and how their interactions impact others, and how they develop, build, and maintain relationships with peers and adults across settings in the school. And finally, we look at decision-making skills. And these are those skills and strategies designed to promote good, responsible decision-making behaviors in our students. All of this is important. And when we put it together, we know that a positive school climate, a positive school culture where students are physically and psychologically safe, where they feel accepted, included, and part of the school community, combined with positive behavior supports that teach our expectations for how students should act in certain settings across the school building, combined with that explicit SEL skills instruction, results in improved outcomes for our students and improved educational outcomes and improved academic outcomes. Elements of effective Tier 1 supports include those indicators listed on this slide. We start with a high quality curriculum, an evidence-based curriculum that covers those social emotional learning skills and ensures that we're providing high quality instruction to our students. Universal screening entails assessments to determine which students may be at risk. And these are beneficial for a couple of reasons. First of all, they help us to identify students who are at risk for more significant mental and behavioral health challenges. But the other critical aspect of universal screening is that it tells us about the health of our system. It tells us about what the needs are of the students in the school communities that we're serving and helps us to ensure that we are selecting and designing social emotional learning curriculum that meets the needs of the students that we are serving. So the universal screening becomes important because it helps us to identify students, but it also tells us about how our practices are improving over time and where we may need to adjust those practices to better support our student needs. We must also include explicit instruction. So when we talk about all of those practices that are good for teaching other academic skills, those are practices that are also relevant for social emotional learning instruction too. So providing direct, explicit skill instruction. This paired with high impact instructional practices. One of the things that the teachers do best is they teach. And that's why it's so important that social emotional learning curriculum at Tier 1 is embedded into our classroom instruction, because teachers are so impactful at teaching students skills. So those high impact instructional practices are so important for teaching SEL as well as for teaching academic skills. It's also important that we're implementing with fidelity. So when schools and districts are selecting their curriculum, when they're identifying how they're going to provide social emotional learning supports within that multi-tiered system, it's important that we ensure that we plan for implementing with fidelity, that we plan for how we'll assess for implementation fidelity, and that we're continually going back to monitor the implementation fidelity and making adjustments when there are difficulties. I often say that when we see a problem with implementation fidelity, it usually means that the system isn't set up to support the implementation. And so that may need that we need to make adjustments in how we're implementing. Finally, opportunities for practice and feedback. So just like when we're teaching kids academic skills, students who are learning social emotional skills need opportunities for practice across a variety of settings, and they need opportunities for direct and specific feedback so that they can make those corrections in the moment. The research tells us that there are significant benefits to implementing social emotional learning skills instruction and implementing it universally and preventatively in our school settings. Some of the benefits include improved attitudes about themselves, about others in the school community, and about their school experiences. We also see increased demonstration of school and relationship facilitating skills in the school community. Schools with social emotional learning programs, high quality social emotional instruction, see better classroom behavior from their students. This means more students staying in class, more students accessing instruction, and improved relationships and interactions throughout the school day. We also see increases in students' academic achievement and their graduation rates over time. The research also suggests that there are improved post-secondary outcomes. So even after students leave our school settings, they continue to benefit from the skills that they learn. They continue to benefit from those self-awareness, self-management, social awareness and relationship skills, and they continue to benefit from those skills that we've taught them about making responsible decisions. We see improved emotional and mental health. Again, these are outcomes that sustain over time, even after students have left our school settings. We see decreases in conduct problems and disciplinary referrals and decreased involvement with law enforcement. So One of the benefits of social emotional learning skills instruction is that it provides us with an opportunity to interrupt the school to prison pipeline. These are some steps that schools can take to integrate SEL and MTSS, or multi-tiered systems of supports, in their settings. One of the first steps is to establish a multidisciplinary leadership team that includes representation from a number of different disciplines in the school community. This can include administration, teachers, but should also include school-employed mental health professionals like school psychologists and school counselors. Together, the multidisciplinary team can create and communicate a shared vision for social emotional learning instruction in the school. That team can also work to assess local needs, culture, and to identify priorities based on the unique needs in their school community, and collect and analyze data to help inform implementation. From there, we create a continuum of instruction and supports using data to identify needs, and then selecting evidence-based curriculum and instructional strategies that aligns with those needs. We can also identify opportunities for supplemental supports. So at the very beginning, we're thinking about how we scale up these services for our students who may need more intensive supports. Finally, we build capacity for implementation. We define the roles and responsibilities of the members of our team and provide training for staff and information for families. It's critical here that our staff have the skills that they need to be able to implement this. Many of our staff members were not provided with this kind of training in their pre-service teaching. And so ensuring that they feel comfortable, not just with the curriculum, but with the strategies that they will use to teach these skills in the classroom is incredibly important. Providing discipline-specific training is important as well. The training that we provide to teachers may look different than the training that we need to provide for our school-employed mental health professionals to ensure that they are ready to take on these activities. That information for parents and families cannot be understated. It's so important that parents and families understand what it is that we're teaching their students, and they understand how they can continue to build on these skills when students are outside of school. So using appropriate parent communication, communication that's culturally responsive, provided in parents' primary language, helps them to continue to enforce these skills outside of the school setting, to talk about what these skills look like outside of the school day. And finally, integrating these supports requires that we embed our framework of multi-tiered supports, our prioritization of social emotional learning, and our education of the whole child in our school culture. If these are not prioritized in our practice, they will not be sustainable. And so it's important that we continue to ensure that this is embedded in the culture and the way that we do business every day. Finally, I want to end with some roles and responsibilities for school staff. Implementing social emotional learning skills instruction in a multi-tiered system of supports truly requires a team effort. It starts with strong leadership from district and building administration. It requires that we prioritize social emotional learning skill instruction. Many times the focus of our educational priorities turns to academic skills, and this is incredibly important. But we know that students who don't come to school with social emotional behavioral skills may not be able to fully access and benefit from instruction in the classroom. So it's important that at the district level and at the building level, we communicate that social emotional learning is a priority. It's a priority for our time, it's a priority for our resources, and it will be embedded in the culture of our school communities. We have to dedicate our time and our resources to be able to deliver this instruction, and we have to prioritize the professional development and support for our staff so that they can do this, but do it well. Our teachers and staff are integral for this work to ensure that we engage them in assisting with planning and implementation, understanding how this will fit within the school day, but also how this will be integrated across the subject areas that they teach. Social emotional learning is most impactful when it's embedded throughout the school day and not just as a standalone lesson. So kids continue to hear the vocabulary, they continue to receive the prompts and the feedback throughout the day. Teachers are so important for ensuring that we implement with fidelity. And so we have to teach them how to implement with fidelity, but we also have to seek their feedback when we find that there are difficulties with implementation. And we have to make some adjustments based on what they are telling us about any challenges that they're facing. Finally, we need to ensure that we have a system for teaching, prompting, modeling, and reinforcing these skills across settings. Again, ensuring that this is part of our school culture and embedded throughout the day, and not just a standalone class that students might access one time a week. Our school psychologists and school counselors are critical for implementation efforts. They are experts in mental and behavioral health and social emotional learning, and they can assist with the planning and the implementation. When we talk about scaling up these efforts, oftentimes these are the professionals who are engaged in determining when students need more intensive supports and delivering those targeted and intensive supports at tiers 2 and 3. So it's incredibly important that they be included in our implementation efforts at tier 1. They can also support with database decision-making. School psychologists in particular are skilled at collecting and analyzing data and helping schools make decisions based on that data. So important to involve them at that universal screening level, and as we move forward with more intensive kinds of data-based collection, progress monitoring data, diagnostic data, school psychologists and school counselors can truly be an asset here. And finally, engaging our families and community members. We need to ensure that we're providing them with information about our social emotional learning curriculum, the skills that we're teaching, and also that they are providing us with feedback about the importance of those skills, how those skills are integrated across other areas of the student life. And they can support us in ensuring that we are engaging in culturally responsive implementation. And so engaging our parents and families is incredibly important when we're planning these initiatives. So with that, I will invite Dr. Kelly back to the screen. And I will stop sharing. And John, we can open it up to questions if you're ready.
Sure. So Shawna, let me just, first, thank you for that overview. There's so many pearls of wisdom that you shared there with us. It's got my mind going in lots of different directions. And so I want to kind of dive into some of these big concepts that you just presented to us. I love the slide that you talked about where you had some of the core elements of tier 1 services. And we're going to talk about data in just a couple of minutes. I want to kind of dive into that just a little bit. But there were two elements which I really want to reinforce and maybe dive into just a little bit deeper. One is this sense of integrating tier 1 services into the classroom. It doesn't have to be a standalone program. It doesn't have to be some expensive curriculum that we purchase. Can you talk just a little bit more? And by the way, I love how you stress the value and the importance of our teacher colleagues and the expertise they bring to it. Would you mind just talking just a little bit about how to integrate not just SEL, but tier 1 in general into that classroom setting?
Yeah, absolutely. I truly believe, and I think the research bears out, that these programs are most successful when we're not teaching them in a bubble. And in fact, when we teach the students the skills, but then when we continually prompt them throughout the day, when it's a good time to use this skill. And so I always talk about skill instruction as being where we push in the skill, we give you all the things, but then we need to prompt you we need to pull those skills out of you throughout the day. So we need to remind you when it's a good time to use those skills. And what it might look like to use that skill across settings. What I think is, again, I work in a high school setting, and I think this applies across the board. What I love is when I see teachers teeing up a difficult math lesson by talking about some of the self-regulation strategies that students can use when they're struggling with a particular concept. I love when I walk into a classroom where there's maybe a spicy topic in the government classroom, and they start that lesson by talking about how we approach situations with some social awareness and how we approach situations non-judgmentally. And so I think when we're doing this well, we're teaching kids those skills explicitly, but we're also reminding them how to use that. And we're prompting them to use these skills throughout the day. And so I think the powerful part of this is when we see teachers using that language throughout the day, it becomes part of how we do business. Kids hear a common vocabulary. The other thing that I would add too is that I'll oftentimes hear, we have a really robust system of positive behavior supports, and how do we integrate that? And I love positive behavior supports, and I think that those are so important for schools and teaching kids what behavior should look like and sound like throughout the day. But one of the things that I love is when I see schools that have started to integrate social emotional learning skills into those positive behavior supports. So it's not just what your behavior looks like and how it sounds like, but how do you treat others in the cafeteria, on the playground, in the hallway. And so really calling on students to use those interpersonal skills as well as those behavioral skills. I think that's when we truly see the impact.
Now, it has to be infused across the board. Again, it can't be standalone. We can't look at these as isolated kind of siloed type programs, but that integration is just so important. And just to give folks a little bit of a preview, and I'll talk more about this at the end, my next conversation is actually going to be with Dr. Maurice Elias, talking specifically about school-wide social emotional programs and how we really do this, how we integrate that in. So make sure you come on back next month for Maurice Elias and joining us for that whole piece. But I love the example that you gave, Shawna, about the difficult math lesson and kind of teeing it up with talking about some of those emotional regulation strategies. And I think about our good friend Byron McClure and Kelsey Reed, just published a book on hacking deficits. And one of the things that they talk about for all of us to really look at, even during challenging times, what can they take from that? What can they learn from that? And so these are ways that we can teach these social emotional skills even during challenging times.
Absolutely.
But the other piece, which I thought, I'm sorry, go ahead. You want to jump in there?
Oh, I just absolutely. That's when we see the power in this kind of work.
Yeah, very much so. The other piece, we can lay out great plans. We can have curriculums in place, but you talked about this implementation fidelity. And quite honestly, that is an area where I see many schools struggling. We get frustrated when programs aren't working. Can you talk a little bit about implementation fidelity and what that really means for our Tier 1 services?
Yeah. So implementation fidelity refers to, are we implementing the curriculum, the intervention as it's designed? Are we covering the lessons to completion? Are we teaching the skills to completion? Are we following that curriculum? And are we doing what we said we would do in terms of gathering data and analyzing data? So fidelity becomes so important because if we're not implementing with fidelity and we don't see the effect that we want, or we don't see results that we like, it's hard to tell if it's the implementation or if maybe we have the wrong curriculum, maybe we have the wrong instructional match. So the fidelity becomes so important. I think it's really important, however, that we talk about fidelity not as a gotcha moment when we see that things aren't being implemented as intended. It's not meant to be a gotcha when we find that maybe our teachers are leaving out a component of the lesson, for example. I think what it compels us to do is to talk about why that's occurring. And I'll just give you an example from some work that I was doing in my high school. We were using an advisory period to teach some skills to some of our students. And one of the things that we heard from teachers is that they were often not able to complete the lesson in the time that they were allotted to do that. And so they were leaving out portions of the lesson. And it turns out some of what they were leaving out was a really important element of the curriculum. So instead of approaching that as you just have to do it and figure out how to do it, we had to engage in some problem solving to support them to be able to provide those lessons to completion, and to talk about how we could make some adjustments in the schedule to support them in doing that.
No, I love that framing of it, to be very honest with you, Shawna, because I often talk about it with my teacher colleagues as these are meant to facilitate the process. Any fidelity checks that we build in, checklists, whatever it may be, these are really meant to facilitate the process. And as you just said, it gives us feedback because we want to make decisions based upon good data. And if we don't have the good data, it's difficult to make some of those decisions on whether things are working or not working. Let me shift for just a moment, because you kind of started out at a really interesting point when you were kind of talking about the triangle and different tiers, and you talked about special education. And oftentimes we look at the tiers as distinct entities rather than recognizing it's really a continuum, and our students exist along that continuum. They could be receiving tier 1 services as well as tier 3 services. And so talk just a little bit more about how tier 1 services benefit some of our kids who are receiving those special education supports, maybe more at that tier 3 level.
Sure. Well, I mean, the simple answer is that highly effective, high quality tier 1 services benefit our students with disabilities because they make it more likely that they will be able to access that least restrictive setting, which is what IDEA is all about, is finding opportunities for students with disabilities to access a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive setting with their non-disabled peers. And when we have really high quality tier 1 systems or tier 2 systems, we provide greater opportunity for students with disabilities to access those services. So even if they spend part of their school day in a more restrictive setting, they have opportunities to access that tier 1 instruction where there are strong behavioral supports, where there are strong components of the social emotional learning skills, where we're cueing and prompting and teaching and modeling and reinforcing them to use those skills so that they can benefit from that least restrictive setting whenever possible. I also, I try to steer clear of those hard and fast lines between tier 1 and tier 2 because it is fluid. And I think we do kids a disservice when we think about kids as being a yellow kid or a red kid. They are all of our kids, and we want them to be able to access intervention fluidly when they need it, but also to benefit from those least restrictive settings or those least restrictive, less intensive interventions when those are appropriate for them. So I push back on models where tier 3 is only accessible to kids with disabilities, because that's actually how we engage in some good preventative work, is by ensuring that those systems are available to all students.
No, and I've said this before in conversations with other people. In my own presentation, I talk about how oftentimes when we find ourselves kind of, I call it top heavy, with a lot of tier 3 services or intensive services, then something's wrong with our tier 1 and maybe even our tier 2 services. And so I think it's critical for folks to really embrace the concept and how important it is. And just to kind of close out the piece on some of our special needs students, they can benefit from those tier 1 services. All those benefits that you talked about, the research behind it, are kids with special needs can benefit in a very similar. In fact, it's often ways we address behavior issues. We address other issues that sometimes we see the needs that are certainly there. So I appreciate that, and thank you. I want to reinforce that because sometimes we've got to shout that more than once for people to hear that piece of it. So let's talk a little bit about data, because data is an important part of tier 1. And this is another area where I sometimes see schools struggle. And it's really the sense of, how do we use data? So you talked a little bit about screening data. In one of my previous conversations with Dr. Katie Eklund, she talked about school-wide screening. Katie's a good friend of ours as well. But how do we use data from universal screening to inform our implementation of tier 1 services?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do think that sometimes data that we collect in universal screening is sometimes misunderstood. What I've heard from some of the schools that I've worked with after we've collected the data is that we knew who those kids were. And so what benefit does this have for us if we could identify those kids? And I think if we're only looking at universal screening data to identify kids that are at risk, we're missing a really critical opportunity. So first of all, I'm really glad that your teachers and your staff know your students, and you're responding to their needs, and you can identify the kids that need intensive supports. That is fantastic. And if that's all we're using the data for, I think we're missing an opportunity, because I think that the tier 1 data gives us an opportunity to really tell us about what the needs are within our system. So it can tell us if our students maybe have some skills that are more foundational than others, but maybe there are some areas where we need to do more work at tier 1, maybe with our relationship skills, for example. And so I think it can tell us about the needs of our students writ large. I also think it can tell us about the health of our system in general. And so I think that we need to be using that data, not just to identify individual students, but to think about what we're seeing from our students as a whole. And I think that we also miss an important opportunity to use it as a source of outcomes data. So not just to inform our intervention delivery, what kinds of skills we're going to teach, and with what frequency and intensity, and what students may be at risk for needing more intensive supports, but also using that data to go back and say, did we make some improvements over time? Like with this cohort of students, we see some improvements over time, with our students in general, as we've implemented these programs. Do we like what we see from this data? I think it's incredibly important that we use that sort of from the evaluative lens as well.
Yeah, and the piece that I love oftentimes, and it's a piece we sometimes miss when we talk about some of this screening data, is it can really help to identify the needs of our school. There are lots of programs out there. You can get all kinds of experts coming in telling you about wonderful programs, but unless it fits the needs of your school, then are we really doing anything? And so, I really see the value, and you kind of said it before when you talk about some of the cultural relevance for programs, things of that nature. It's really important for me to have folks understand that when we're talking about tier 1 services, make sure that you understand the needs of your school, of the unique culture of your school, the unique needs of the community, of the teachers, parents, so on and so forth. So I think that that's really important. But let's kind of talk about data in a little bit different way, in terms of we have tier 1 services in place. What data should we be collecting? What data is available to kind of see, well, how's this helping our students? What's the impact been? Do we need to change things around? Can you talk about what data do we have, maybe to take a look at for that?
Yeah, I think really important to look at different data points. So again, continuing to look at that universal screening data, not just to identify students at risk, but to look at that data over time to see if we've had an impact, and if we've had an impact in particular skill areas. I do think that we can look at other sources of information as well. And so when districts are looking at selecting curriculum, I think looking at data comprehensively to think about the needs of our community. And so those can be things like absentee data. If we have students that are highly transient, either within our district or between districts, that is data that is relevant to us. Our student-specific data, like time in class, office disciplinary referrals, any kind of school removal for suspension, expulsion data, that is all important data for us as well. And I also think it's so important for us to ensure that we are tracking data related to those sort of minor disciplinary infractions or minor disciplinary issues. And this is where our teacher colleagues become an important source of information too, because they can tell us about what's happening in the classroom that might disrupt the instruction. And those things might not lead to an office disciplinary referral. They might not lead to a student being out of a classroom, but a teacher can tell you, my students are struggling in their interactions when we do group work. My students are struggling with self-managing during independent activities. My students are struggling with whole group kinds of instruction. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that can tell us too, not only what the needs are, but also what kind of an impact we're seeing from the implementation of our curriculum.
I think that, we often use the phrase database decision making. And we certainly talk about different ways to look at data. And I always like to reinforce this concept of there's a lot of data that schools have available to them. You can, again, use different, measurements, different assessments to pick up data. But the reality is, and you just mentioned, quite a few of them, schools have a lot of data, and we just need to use that data more effectively and at times more efficiently, because it helps to guide the programs that are there. So, early today, you talked a little bit about the use of mental health professionals. And one of the kind of strengths of school psychologists, for example, is in understanding data and data interpretation. So how can you utilize your school-based mental health professionals, such as school psychologists, school counselors, in the implementation or even the development of Tier 1 services?
I think one of the highest impact things that we can do, one of the best ways to leverage these professionals, is to have them on board that multidisciplinary team from the start, bringing them in to help with the planning and to help with designing what the implementation is going to look like. What I often hear from school psychologists is that, and I'm sure that this is true of some of our other school employed mental health professional colleagues, they're stretched pretty thin. They have a lot going on throughout the day. But I think if there's one place that we can bring them in, and one place that we can really leverage their skills, it's in that multidisciplinary leadership team, because so many of the skills that they're trained in lend themselves to that. Being able to help to look at that data, to analyze that data, to determine how we might leverage that data to inform what we're going to implement and how we're going to implement it and how we're going to monitor that over time. That is a really high impact strategy. So I think one of the most important things that we can do is bring them into that multidisciplinary team at the forefront.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to add to that, and I'm just curious your thoughts. You're right. Our school psychologists, our social workers, our school counselors, a variety of different activities that they're involved in, and we won't even bring in shortages and sometimes limitations on resources that are there. But the actual implementation of programs. So I think about, for example, our consultant roles as school psychologists and working with our teacher colleagues to understand the needs of their students. One of the elements that you talked about in the big ideas was trauma-informed practices. And for me, trauma-informed practices, particularly, this time period that we're going through right now, is very, very critical Tier 1 type of support. And so using the expertise of the mental health professionals to help build this curriculum, to help build the response of support for all of our students. Again, not targeted supports, not those intensive supports, but for all of our students. Do you want to comment at all about, maybe something along those lines?
Yeah, I sure do. I love trauma-informed practices. I love that we're having these conversations about what trauma-informed practices look like. I think we need to shift the conversation from trauma-informed to trauma-responsive. It is not just enough for us to be aware of trauma and its impact on learning and behavior and mental health, but we have to be able to respond to it. And this is where I think school-employed mental health professionals like school psychologists are so critical to making that shift from trauma-informed to trauma responsive, because that is so in our wheelhouse. Understanding not just what trauma looks like, but how trauma impacts the brain and how trauma impacts ability to learn, and why that might make it particularly difficult in a math setting, for example. And so I do feel like when we involve our school employed mental health professionals, as school psychologists, that's what I know. So I always go back to that, but that's when we start to make that shift from trauma informed to trauma responsive. And that's where I think we're really starting to make a difference for our students and for student learning.
Yeah, I love that reframe, because I think it's very, very accurate. I know sharing before and joking a little bit about being down here in St. Croix, but I'm not down here solely on vacation, kind of soaking up the sun. I'm down here doing work with the Department of Education, and I just literally came from a school prior to jumping on here today, who the school is struggling significantly. The students here, not only are dealing with the pandemic and repercussions from the pandemic, but are still reeling from the impact of Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria, which devastated the Caribbean down here. And so the trauma responsiveness is really critical. And it's important for the staff to understand the impact of years of traumas, years of stressful events that the students have experienced. And so I love the reframe, Shawna. It's something that all students really need, which is really, very, very critical that is there. And yes, I think, that I do want to reinforce the role of your school-based mental health professionals, because we don't expect teachers to understand it all. We don't expect teachers to do it all. Administrators are working really hard at this. And so it's truly that team effort that becomes, critical component of truly an effective system that is there. So I know it's amazing how quickly these hours go, but I want to cover a couple of other quick areas. I never like to have anyone leave any of these conversations without some concrete ideas. We've been talking, about tier 1 services and the importance of tier 1 services and data organization, and decides, okay, I need to start really focusing on my tier 1 services. What are some things that folks should be thinking about right now to bring back tier 1 services to their schools?
Yeah, I think for me, some of the key takeaways are first and foremost identifying the key members of that multidisciplinary team. And so starting with strong multidisciplinary leadership across the board, ensuring that we're bringing in the teachers and the mental health professionals is so important. I do think that the universal screening is an incredibly important to start. As you alluded to, John, I think we do ourselves a disservice if we start investing in curriculum without really ensuring that it's the right match for the needs of our students. And so I think that the universal screening becomes so important. And again, collecting that additional data as well. So not just the universal screening data, but thinking about other sources of data that may also be relevant to our decision making as well. And I really do feel like, this presentation is about social emotional learning, but to me, you can't unconnect the social emotional learning and the positive behavior supports. And so if schools are already engaged in good, robust, positive behavioral intervention and support implementation, ensuring that we're sitting with those things together, because to me, they really do complement and enhance one another. And so rather than thinking about those things separately, I think it's important that we think about them together.
So I apologize, my internet's getting a little unstable. I closed down my camera for a moment.
Good to see you.
I'm hoping you can still hear me at this point. Excellent. So, where can folks go? Do you have any direction or any resources? We will be sending out follow-up material after this conversation. But Shawna, if folks again are really motivated after this conversation, do you?
I think I lost John's audio, but in terms of resources, I think the CASEL resources, CASEL, those resources, that's where I went in preparation for this presentation, thinking about key points that I wanted to make. I think that is one of the best resources. The National Institute for Mental Health resources are fantastic. And frankly, for me as a school psychologist, I would be remiss if I didn't mention all of the resources that are available through the National Association of School Psychologists. Again, that's where I go for my go-to, but your school employed mental health professionals, they will have resources from their professional associations as well. And so I think those are all good resources, but the CASEL website, the CASEL framework, that I think is the place to start.
Well, it looks like we lost Dr. Kelly. So I'm going to jump in for a minute because we do have a question, and
sure.
Technically we're in the Q&A portion of this webinar.
Okay.
So Lauren Erickson has the question for you. what SEL universal screener do you use?
Okay.
And do you
Our
use a specific SEL curriculum for instruction?
Yeah, so our district is using the DESA screener, and that is aligned. So DESSA, DESA, it is aligned with the Castle framework, and so it gives us information about student skills across those domains. And there are actually a number of things that you can pull from their materials that are linked to those. So if you see deficits in certain skill areas, you can look at activities that will benefit students, and those can be done at the universal level, but they can also be, classroom to classroom, group to group. Other programs that I like, Second Step is a great program. That one has been around for a while. I like that program as a parent. It's the program that my daughter's school uses. And so I see the weekly handouts that come home. I see the homework that we do together, really talking about what those skills look like in our family and talking about how we prioritize those. So that's another one for
The Second Step. I'm putting these here in the chat so
okay.
you can reference them. I don't have the URLs. Normally, if Dr. Kelly was on with us, I would.
You'd be looking for the,
be
yeah,
able to
DESA is
add-
the
looking
screener we
for those,
use.
but I'm just putting them there.
Yeah, I believe FastBridge also has a screener. And again, I know that because that's the screener that they're using in my daughter's school. We've used the SSBD, the Systematic Screening for Behavior Disorders. I think there's pros and cons to all of these. And by the way, I'm not affiliated with any of them. They're just some that I know of. I think there's pros and cons to all of those, but that's another one that I've seen some districts use with some success.
And Dr. Kelly, we just had a question in the chat as to which screener Shawna and Dr. Kelly uses, and so she just went into a discussion about that, but maybe that's something that you can also elaborate on as well too, and as much as you are a practicing school psychologist as well. In terms
Sure, I apologize that as I had mentioned, technology challenges. My internet went down here, so I'm joining it via my phone. But the use of screeners is very individualized in many ways. I'll be quite honest with you. I think that it depends on what data you're looking for. I saw that Shawna talked about, I believe it was FastBridge was the one that you were talking about, Shawna, as I kind of came back in.
Yeah.
But, I think about, again, I mentioned Katie Eklund, and I think some of the work that she has done in Wisconsin using the SAVERS, and that's looking really at social emotional needs of students. There are more specific ones that maybe if you're looking, at anxiety or depression, there are screeners that are out there for that. I tend to look at more the broad-based type of screeners. Because again, when we think about screening, we're really talking about trying to paint with a broad brush. But again, if your needs are much more specific, there are lots of screeners that are out there, related to specific issues. So again, I apologize for cutting out there, Shawna. I'm glad that you kind of picked up on the resources and where folks can go to. We're again coming close to the end. George, were there any other questions from the chat that we need to address at this point?
Well, I have a couple of practical questions. I posted your social media handles in the chat, Shawna. I didn't see in your presentation any links. How can people follow you outside of that? You mentioned that you're presenting at some conferences coming up, and in as much as our audience is a mix of school psychologists, mental health providers, and also special educators, maybe you can give us a rundown, because I know some of our people will be attending a lot of these upcoming conferences. So why don't you let us know and where we can follow you and learn more about you?
Sure. Well, I'm trying to be better about using my LinkedIn account, so you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I am here in Houston at the Student Mental Health conference and the School Safety and Security conference right now. I go back home for a while, and then I'll be at the CASE conference, so the Council for Administrators of Special Education in Salt Lake, and then my next big conference will be the National Association of School Psychologists conference in Denver. So I'm making some stops at some state association conferences. I'm doing a presentation for the Tennessee Association of School Psychologists next week. And but after that, the big convention will be the NASP convention in Denver. So I hope I see some people there.
Oh, that's awesome. And do you have any publications, presentations, research that we should be made aware of? Have you done any books or anything that we can look for? Because sometimes our viewers like to go out and look for supplementary resources.
I wish. I am a full-time school psychologist, so most of my day is spent in my school, in my office. I have a book chapter that's in press right now that'll be coming out in the best practices in school psychology book. It seems like those things take forever. And some articles that I've written. One with Dr. Eklund, Dr. Katie Eklund, who John mentioned. But my wheelhouse is mostly in my office, working with kids, in my principal's office, helping to work with students. So no great publications, but I love talking to people. So feel free to reach out. You're welcome to share my email too.
Okay.
George. I'm old school that way. Just email me and I'm happy to have a dialogue.
So I just dropped your social media handles again, and I'm going to drop your email right now into the chat as well. So if any of you have any questions, would like to follow Dr. Kelly, we invite you to do so. It's all there in the chat now.
I say it each and every one of these conversations, and Sean, I appreciate what you just offered. It's nice to say, when someone says, "Oh, reach out to me," but it's important for you to know Shawna means that. Shawna is an expert in this area. She's a practitioner, so her advice is very real, and it's things not just kind of theoretical. Or something that sounds nice. It's something I know that Shawna has either used or helped other districts develop. The piece that I probably didn't tell too much about, Shawna, about you is you consult with school districts throughout Montana to help them develop these programs. And so any advice you get from Shawna is very practical and real in nature.